But it gave me this sort of sense that I didn't have to adhere to the script that society had given me to how to be a person. I could be whoever I wanted, and I'm never going to stop being grateful to them for that. It was magical.
Today, we're really, really thrilled to welcome Helen Macdonald. Helen is a writer, poet, naturalist, and historian of science. Her book, H is for Hawk, won many prizes, including the Samuel Johnson Prize for Non-Fiction, the Costa Book of the Year, the Prix de Meilleur Livre Étranger in France, and it was shortlisted for the National Book Critics Circle Award in the US. Helen's Sunday Times and New York Times bestseller, Vesper Flights, was named one of the best books of the summer by the New York Times, Entertainment Weekly, Time Magazine, and Literary Hub. She's a frequent contributor to the New York Times Magazine, and she lives in Suffolk. Her interviewer today is our very own Will Govan from the Moth, artist and co-director of the Moth, who also happens to be passionate about nature. So please sit back and enjoy.
One of the things I've got a million things I'd like to ask you, but one thing I kept on coming back to is where have all the kestrels gone?
Oh. Well, actually, no one knows. This is a terrible question to ask me, because no one knows. We've lost a lot of grassland, so kestrels like to hunt voles and small mammals. Famously, they were always to be seen visibly hovering around the verges of motorways in Britain. They were the motorway hawk. And I think the reason that they're not as often seen is because a lot of those motorway verges have simply grown up into scrub and forest now. It's just a function of time passing. Yeah. So they're not visible to motorists as often as they were. And there's also, I think, some evidence that there are more buzzards now. There are more kind of kites and stuff, and they don't live particularly happily together. But most of all, I think it's habitat loss. We're losing that rough grassland full of voles and mice that they love. And the British countryside is becoming more and more, empty and quiet, and that's what's really driving their decline.
It's interesting because when I was a child, and actually when I in H is for Hawk, which you simply must read, because regardless of whether you're interested in hawks, I defy anybody to read this book and not find it absolutely glorious. But also, you will come away with the desire to get a hawk.
Actually, I just need to butt in here. There was a lot of stress in the falconry community. I use community very, very loosely because falconers are possibly the most grumpy with each other group there are. I mean, you put two in a room and there are 65 different opinions. But they were very worried about this book because they were like, it's going to be like Kes, right? When Kes came out in the 60s, everyone went and got kestrels, and it was a disaster. All this, awful. But luckily, apparently, I made falconry seem so difficult and miserable. No one has gone out and got a hawk.
I didn't know about that. But when I was a child, the only birds of prey that we saw were kestrels, and we heard tawny owls, and my father would tell me about during the war and in the 40s and late 40s about sparrowhawks, and I must have been about 12 when I saw my first sparrowhawk. And I noticed that in your book you talked about seeing a sparrowhawk with your dad.
Yeah, they're really rare then.
Yeah, and so I was thinking, gosh, I hadn't even seen one at that stage. And the curious thing is that throughout over the last 20, 30 years, the buzzards
Yeah.
came back.
Yeah.
The red kite
Yeah.
that I went to see with my father, that was their last pairs were in the Elan Valley. in
Yeah, there was
Wales.
like one there, wasn't it? It's like, oh,
It was amazing.
Yeah.
And then they were released actually 5 miles up the road in
Yeah, it's really interesting.
in Wickham.
yeah,
So there seemed to be this, and then we saw Barn Owl, and this is all within 17 miles of central London.
yeah,
We saw Barn Owl, so it seemed to me like things were working back in the 1950s. The Thames was proclaimed as being dead, and then now we have otters in every county in
absolutely,
the UK. So
absolutely.
there seems to be a lot of good stuff happening.
There's good stuff happening. I mean, I've got a lot to say, as you can imagine, a lot to say about this.
Yeah.
So, with sparrowhawks, the reason they were really rare was pesticides. So DDT got banned because of extreme, public opposition to what it was doing, and that was banned. I have to say, in Europe, it's still not banned in other parts of the world, of course, because and that's as soon as that was gone, the sparrowhawks started coming back. And things like red kites and buzzards, that was simple persecution by people. That was not to do with habitat loss. That was just because they were shot. And the red kites are really interesting. So the ones that were left in Wales, the reason they were there is because there really weren't any gamekeepers in those areas that were trying to control their numbers to preserve game populations. So they survived in those regions, but they were doing really badly. They were starving. There's not enough food in those Welsh valleys to really keep a population thriving. And they were sort of feeding their young on kind of year-old rotten lamb's tails that had been cut. So as soon as they were released into Britain, they just thrived, and they're everywhere now. And the thing about the great flourishing of raptors that worries me is that I'm really happy to see them, but when you look at the sky and you see soaring red kites and soaring buzzards and there's sparrowhawks everywhere, whatever, and you think, hooray, everything's fine, they're masking the astonishingly precipitous decline of very common farmland birds, for example. So we see the success story, it's very visible, but the insects are being lost, the habitat's being lost, the birds are being lost, and we don't see those things. So it's swings and roundabouts, this story.
I often think, I thought perhaps maybe the kestrel was abundant because there wasn't, the other raptors weren't there. So perhaps it's just natural that, the sparrowhawks come back and the buzzards
Peregrines eat kestrels, yeah, they do,
and so they're kind of territorial. So perhaps there shouldn't have been that many kestrels around originally. But what I found very striking about that area is because these creatures are kind of left largely unmolested. There is an abundance, and I wanted you to tell, and I've obviously had the benefit of reading your work, but I wanted you just to tell me about growing up in the place that you did, which seemed incredibly special.
Yeah, I had this really bonkers childhood. So my parents are both journalists. My dad was a photojournalist, and my mum was a local journalist, and quite sort of cynical, not cynical, but wasn't really raised in any faith, and they bought this house on a 50-acre. Former, a bit like an estate. It had formal gardens and parks and ponds and forests and a meadow, and it was owned by the Theosophical Society. I don't know how many of you have had any run-ins with the Theosophists. Now that sounds wrong. They're not very warlike, but basically a 19th century esoteric mystical society. And so they bought this house, and suddenly I was surrounded by these incredibly eccentric people. It was an incredible place to grow up. So. There were lots of elderly ladies. A lot of them were refugees from Nazi Germany because theosophy had been banned there in the 30s. There were concert pianists, ex-SOE operatives. Mimi apparently still had cyanide pills in her cupboard just in case the Nazis returned. There was Kate Batty Smith, who had a great auk egg in a drawer. I mean, it was amazing. And I think these sort of wonderful elderly ladies never had interminable affairs with each other's husbands. It was amazing. There was one chap who asked, you went to Cambridge. Where do you find stabling for your horse? I had dreadful trouble in the 30s. But it gave me this sort of sense that I didn't have to adhere to the script that society had given me to how to be a person. I could be whoever I wanted. And I'm never going to stop being grateful to them for that. It was magical.
In H's for Hawk, you talk about your childhood passion for natural history, and you discuss it again in the essay in Vesper Flights. But I know you went and you ultimately studied English. So but you were determined to be a naturalist. So what happened along the way at school that stopped you from going to study zoology. Which is
Oh, I'm
what I
just
imagine
terrible
you
at
do.
maths.
What?
Genuinely.
But I am too. But it was it seemed, and like, I don't know whether it was just a thing in those days. If you weren't good at maths, then you couldn't possibly do science.
Well, I think I realised that I wanted to be the kind of biologist that really only existed in the 19th century and 18th century and 17th century, which was the kind of person that obviously was richer than God and just wandered around the world collecting animals. I mean, you didn't really do that anymore. You needed to have your stats, right? And also, literature had been something that, I was a compulsive reader as a child, and I lived for books as well. So my whole life really has been this kind of pinging between these two poles of. I look back now and I think of these. This is a slightly pretentious way of describing. It's very pretentious, but back in medieval times, there were the two ways of living your life. There was the contemplative way, and there was the active way. And the contemplative way was always represented by a monk bowed over a manuscript in a library, and the active way was a falconer on a horse, right?
Yeah.
So I would ping between wanting to be a sort of researcher, writer, author, and being kind of a falconer or naturalist. And I think H's for Hawk, the book, was the first time that those two parts of me were in the same place. It was an incredible moment to realize I could do both at once. But until then, it was always just one or the other. So when I finished my English degree, I went off and bred falcons for sheikhs in the Middle East, because as you do, after you've done an English degree. And I hate being bored, so I constantly changed career, much to my mother's worry. What are you doing now?
For those of you who haven't read the book, one's eyes just slip down the page. It's so exquisitely written. But what I found really striking about it is that it's very, very tender, and but there's extraordinary kind of academic rigour in it as well. And I know you're obviously, you are an academic, but the book is not only obviously explores this relationship with you and the hawk, but also as the parallel story of what's his initials?
T.H. White.
Terence
Andrew White.
Which is an extraordinary, and I hope you're benefiting from the sales of his book. They
No,
must
not
have
at
gone
all.
through the roof.
No, not at all.
You should have done.
What an extraordinary man.
We should have worked that into the contract somehow. It's an absolutely brilliant book, and I've only kind of dipped into it. But my gosh, he's so utterly contemporary. He speaks so directly to the reader. And I wondered how your relationship with him changed from when you were a child to when you revisited the book.
It's a really good question, and I'm sure many of you have come across T.H. White he did this magisterial retelling of the Arthurian story, The Once and Future King, and the first book in that series, The Sword in the Stone, was made into a film by Disney, which is still bewilders me. But it's an extraordinary book. It's a wonderful book. It's one of my favourite books as a child, and one of the reasons for that was that Merlin the magician transforms the young will-be Arthur, the Ward, into different animals to educate him in the ways of the world. So he becomes a hawk to learn some things, or a fish. And I was obsessed with this. And then I read another book by him called The Goshawk, which was the story of him his attempt to train a goshawk in the 1930s. And it was one of the most terrible experiences of my reading childhood, because it was I was a pedantic falconer, would-be falconer, and he did everything wrong. And B, it was a very distressing book. He tortures this bird, and he doesn't have any of the tools to know how to deal with it. And of course, as I got older and reread the book and learned more about his life, he was a closeted gay guy. He was, deeply unhappy, had an awfully abusive childhood, both at home and at school. And I just realized that, he hadn't been given any of the tools to know how to love other things, including himself. And he saw the bird as himself. He saw this bird as everything he wanted to be. It was feral. He says it was feral, it was fey, it was a fairy, it was ferocious, it was all the things. And that really, I think, I needed to have it in my book, because my book is also about the same kind of thing, in that I saw in my bird, in Mabel the goshawk, the grief that I was feeling. She lived in the present moment. I wanted to live in the present moment, but she was ferocious, she was wild, she was uncontrollable, and I wanted to be non-human. I didn't want to feel the emotions that I was feeling after the death of my father. And what T.H. White did and what I did was the same, and that is what we all do all the time, and that is we see the natural world as a mirror of ourselves. And the academic stuff, really, the analytic stuff in the book, is all about that. It's about how, you know, we are taught when we're young that nature is the one place where there is completely free of human meanings. But it's like the Baudelaire quote, right? The greatest trick the devil ever played was teaching us that telling us he doesn't exist, or persuading us he doesn't exist. We put all our most deeply held beliefs into the natural world, and then we see them there, and then we see them as natural. So yeah, I mean, the book is about how we see ourselves in the creatures around us, and the terrible errors that we make, not only to ourselves, but to the creatures, and we reduce what they are by doing so.
Well, perhaps you'd like to just tell us about the time when the hawk mistakes you for the pheasant in the hedge.
It's just really funny. So we're in this farmland, you know, and I was hunting with this bird. You know, I you know, whatever you feel about hunting, what was going on with the bird is I just feel if you keep a hawk, your job is to let the hawk behave as much as possible like a wild one. And goshawks are highly predatory. And also I had no money, so actually living off rabbits and pheasants that the bird caught was actually brilliant. And there were some rough meals back then. I remember stewed elderly rabbit and stale crumpets was pretty much a low point. Oh, I still can't eat rabbit. Anyway, there was this one time there was a pheasant in a bush, and she was in a tree above, and I was trying to get this pheasant out, and I kind of stuck my head through this hedge, and she just saw my head and just was really keyed up. You know, these guys go into kind of berserker mode when they're hunting. And she just came down and just like hit me with her talons, and it was a really extraordinary moment. You know, goshawks don't just grab things. The force of their blow, I mean, it's like being hit with a baseball bat. And I had like, you know, 8 punctures in my head, and they were kind of sort of singing, and, you know, she was up a tree going, you know, oh, that was stupid, that wasn't a pheasant. And I'm just like, oh, I'm staggering around. And then I just got really woozy, and I was kind of holding her, and I sat down for a bit, because I was a bit kind of like, you know, what the hell's going on? And the sun was going down. And I remember just sitting there going, oh, it's really beautiful. Look at the sun. And then she started baiting at my face, like trying to get to my face. And I'm like, what is this? And I realized there was just blood running down my face, and she was like trying to eat me. And I was like, that's just really gothic, you know. But yeah, that was an honest mistake. They're not vicious creatures. They're, you know, Mabel was really playful. I used to play with her all the time. Yeah.
Tell us about the game that you played with.
Yeah, it's really funny. I used to play with her, and all my goshawk friends are all kind of, you know, tattooed blokes. I mean, I've got tattoos. I feel that seems like a really weird way of saying it. Like,
Are they hawks? Or?
Yeah, no, mostly they're hawks and, you know, motorbikes and stuff. And they were all like, you know, what are you talking about? Goshawks are feathered shotguns. You don't play with them. I was like, oh, well, what do you do with it? And I was like, well, I scrunch up paper into balls and I throw them, and she catches them in her beak and she throws them back, and they're like. Anyway, later I discovered that they all started doing it. But they wouldn't let on. Because, you know, you don't do that with a goshawk. But yeah, they're really playful. So I mean, another moment with animals, really, you know, that sense, you know, we trapped goshawks in our notion of what they should be. But like all animals, they're way more than that. You know, they're much more complicated and fascinating. And I think, you know, playing with the goshawk was one of the very few moments of joy, I think, in that year. I was very, very miserable.
You said, and you mentioned this before earlier, but the H's for hawk was, and obviously, you know, there's loads of references and etc. with T.H. White, but it is overwhelmingly a very, very moving and tender book. And the experience of losing your father, and I lost my dad last year, so I found that I think, I mean, everybody would find the book very moving, but I suppose it, you know, affected me at this stage. That enabled you to write something which was very different to what you. I mean, you opened yourself up.
Yeah, it was weird. When I started writing that book, it was very different. I didn't think anyone would be interested in me at all. I thought they wanted to know about the hawk because, you know, that was more interesting. So I was quite British about it to start with, and I would write quite, you know, I didn't really put any emotions or talk about me in it. And it just didn't work. I kept running into a brick wall, and the writer's block. It took about 5 years to get to the point where I started writing at all. I needed to wait. You know, I think there are 2 kinds of books about grief. There are the ones that are written right in the middle of it, that kind of battlefield craziness, like Joan Didion's Theory of Magical Thinking is an incredible book, but it's written right in the middle of it. Yeah. And then those are written afterwards, and that's what I had to do. And then, like in this moment when I'm trying to write this book and I'm just talking about the birds, and I realised that I was being dishonest to the reader. And the only way I could write this book would be to be absolutely honest and as vulnerable as I could be about what it was like. And as soon as I made that, I had that realization and started trying to do it, the book just sang. It was extraordinary. So that was like a real lesson to me. But I think also, all my work has got a lot of me in it, and I hope it's not, I hope it's not because I'm just really self-obsessed. I think I grew out of that when I was about 28, maybe a bit later. It's my cues taken from anthropology, so it's reflexivity, right? It's a kind of reflexive way of, if you present yourself as a character in your own work, the reader can see where your own biases are, where my biases are, and why I have those biases, and then they have a much better way of judging whether what I'm saying is true, and that's why I do it.
Sometimes I interview somebody and they've written, a marvelous book and a kind of seminal work in a sense. Know often about their coming of age, etc. And then
finding themselves.
Yeah, finding themselves, and it's something that it might have been very highly acclaimed, and then the publisher says, you've got to write another book.
Yeah, P is for parrot, mate.
And invariably that is a book of short stories.
There it is.
And is that?
Yeah, there's no way. I mean, I had to do something. Yeah. There's no way that you could. Yeah, you can't follow Just for Hawk. It's a difficult second album, right? So there was no way I could write another big, meaningful book. So I thought just change up the style. And at the same time, I'd been writing for these different places, and I also kind of really got into the essay form. So. I was the worst student at school. The word essay used to send me into kind of panic, but the form of an essay is great. And one of the reasons I love it is because every single one of these essays in this book, I'm not holding it up to sell it, I'm just, this one. I just can't get over this guillemot. The cormorant skull is amazing. Every single one is like a little puzzle that I had about the natural world or about our response to it or something that's puzzling me. And the way that essays spool out, it always feels like the reader is right behind me looking over my shoulder and we're working out together. This is obviously nonsense, there's no one there. But it seems to me these short pieces, the kind of breadth of them, the extent of them, they always feel more generous to me. They feel that they're like a walk or a conversation rather than a great kind of outpouring of analysis or memoir. And I really like them for that. And the weird thing about Vesper Flights, of course, is that it's come out during the most appalling pandemic. And my concentration span has been shot to pieces. Right. I can barely watch a TV program without wanting to make some toast or do something else. And I really like that they're really short because you can pick up one and read it. And put it down and then pick up another one.
Lovely collection, and I would you just because there's one. It's a very very positive book, and in terms and there's one thing which I found really, it's obviously very very relevant, and that's the the apocalypse.
Yes.
The pending apocalypse, and can you just?
Can I read that bit?
Yeah,
yes.
Yeah. Would you? Because it's just amazing.
Let me just plant my microphone.
The nice bit.
The nice bit.
Yeah. The bit which says that the world's not just going to blow up right now.
This is a really weird essay. This essay is about migraine headaches and climate breakdown. And I didn't know until I started writing about migraine headaches that it was actually about climate breakdown. But that's what happened. Okay. We are already in the early stages of planetary ecological breakdown, the prodrome of catastrophe. Our eschatological traditions tend to envision the apocalypse as happening very fast with the dawning of one final, single, dreadful day. But the systems of the wider world do not operate according to the temporalities of our human lives. We're already inside the apocalypse, and forest fires and Category 5 hurricanes are as much signs of it as the rising of the beast from the pit. Apocalyptic thinking is a powerful antagonist to action. It makes us give up agency, feel that all we can do is suffer and wait for the end. And that is not what we must be thinking now. For an apocalypse is not always a cataclysmic ending, and not always a disaster. In its earliest senses, the word meant a revelation, a vision, an insight, an unveiling of things previously unknown. And I pray that the revelation our current apocalypse can bring is the knowledge that we have the power to intervene. Just as the structures of the migraine-stricken brain can be altered, even if we don't believe it to be true until it happens, so might the structures of a world locked into what feels like an inevitable reliance on fossil fuels and endless economic growth. There are actions we can take that seem impossible and pointless, and yet they are entirely and precisely and absolutely required. We can exert pressure, we can speak up, we can march and cry and mourn and sing and hope and fight for the world, standing with others even if we don't believe it. Even if change seems an impossibility. For even if we don't believe in miracles, they are there and they are waiting for us to find them.
I'd like to thank you so much, and I'm sorry that I didn't meet you when I was a child. But
I was a bit of a nightmare, to be honest. I don't think you missed anything.
But I'm so delighted.
It's been a pleasure.
Able to
Thank
meet
you
you
very
now.
much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you very much.
Thank you.